Welcome to part two. This is one of my favorite segments because everything we're going to talk about today relates to the operation of the business. And so much of the experience for owners in your situation is you're dealing with the operation. And a lot of times that's why the financial consideration comes last, because you're thinking about how do we produce this work? How do we keep the client happy? How do we make sure all of our subcontractors and employees are paid on time? All of that stuff consumes the majority of your thinking. And then the economics are sort of have to fall behind that in terms of priority. But the point of today is to communicate why at least the economics should be, should sort of keep pace with that other thinking in terms of the priority of your thinking. So I'm excited to talk through this. So how much does it cost to produce the thing that you sell? That is sort of like the essential question here. And there are two ways to understand that question. And the one you use, the one you apply to your business, depends on what kind of business you have. But in general, we're talking about unit economics and project costing. Those are the two frames to apply to your thinking and to get like a little bit more specificity out of it. So I think the unifying theme between the first segment and this segment is sort of captured in this line. It's to make a big deal about the small things and then do that over and over again. That is really the kind of behavior that is going to separate your business from the majority. So like the majority over here in this like dense, ball is how I visualize it. And when you start to do those small things over and over again, you have a business that's differentiating itself in terms of discipline and in terms of the financial gains that you'll see from that. So we'll start with unit economics. So here's your thing, and your thing has its own little micro economy in it. We're going to talk about how that sort of fits in. So the focus for the first part to understand that little micro economy is your direct costs. So the best way to evaluate something, if something is a direct cost, is to ask, could the thing happen without this expense? Or I also like to sort of separate it into two segments. Here's the stuff to do the thing, and then here's the stuff to support the thing. Those are sort of like two different categories that inform which filter applies to your expense. So in general, before we just like dive into it, most businesses, when they're evolving, they don't think about segmentation of expense. They just think of expense like detracts from revenue, and whatever I have left over is profit. And I'm going to show you that applying a little bit more precision to that is the thing that actually gives you those gains that you're striving for. So here's the framework, the stuff to do the thing. So let's take a landscape company like mowing a lawn, for example. To mow a lawn, you need a mower, you need a person to push the mower, you need gas to put in the mower so that it can run, and you need a truck to move it all around. And so the expenses that correlate with each of those four items, those are direct expenses. The thing could not happen. You could not mow the lawn unless you paid out those expenses. Wouldn't happen. Now, to run a landscape company more broadly, this is the stuff to support that first activity. So to run a landscape company, you need, blades for the mowers. You need people scheduling the crews and talking to clients. You need a building for it all to go in, and you need oil changes for the trucks. But the lawn can still get mowed without those things. And so that's why they occupy two different categories of expense, and why it makes sense to be precise about it. So for the things that are the direct expenses, they go under the umbrella of cost of goods sold. That's that first filter in this sort of like filter framework we've been referring to over and over again. And then operating expenses go in that second filter, and they have different roles to play within the business. So they both relate to the same activity, landscaping, but they have different roles in how you run the business. So understanding how direct costs work, it allows us to sort of think about the P&L and the operation of your business with a little bit more precision. So reading the P&L, broadly speaking, it looks like revenue, right? Trying to make it through these filters, and the first filter of cost of goods. But actually that those individual units, they have their own like cost and expense profiles like within it, which is what makes your business a little bit more complicated than just, sort of 3 steps where you sell, filter, profit, right? It's not as simple as that, as you know. So so this is how these little like economies work. So within each unit, you've got the price of that thing, the direct cost, and the profit, the gross profit that you generate as a function of doing that activity. But the granularity comes in when you start to apply focus about like what's happening economically within that unit. So in this example, like if you had your unit cost $6 to do the thing and you generated $4 of gross profit, that would start to detract from the performance of the little like visualization on the left, because right now we've got 5 units making it through that first filter. But if the economic profile of one of those units doesn't support that, you're going to have less profit to be able to provide for the rest of the business. So when those little changes happen, it affects the big changes. So it affects gross profit there. And if the change is negative, or if it's positive, but if it's negative, it affects the larger picture. So the scrutiny applied to the granularity of this filter makes a huge difference to the financial performance of the business. And by the way, the best businesses really are really focused on these little micro changes that happen within this filter. So let's take a look at this scenario. We've got a pretty basic cost structure on the left. So $10 to sell the work, $5 to do the thing, $5 in gross profit, $3 in operating expense, $2 in profit. The reason I like using the math of this little illustration for conceptual purposes is that you can translate it into percentages and it applies to much larger businesses, but you still get the point. So if this was 50% cost of goods sold, 50% gross margin, that's the percentage expression of gross profit, 30% operating expense, 20% profit. You can apply that same framework to much larger businesses and have that framework be relevant, but it sort of lands most closely when you express it in dollars. So if you take that scenario and sort of transpose the evolution of things on the right, and you say, okay, we sold the thing for $10. It only cost us $4 to produce it instead of $5. Now we have a gross profit of $6 or a 60% gross margin. Operating expense stays the same at $3. And now our profit is 30% instead of 20%. So like that's a big difference. And it would be a big difference. It would matter to your business if that only happened one time. But the reason gross margin is powerful as a measure of business performance is because these unit economic activities occur a lot in your business. There are many revolutions to these things. So when you think about like the activity of a landscaping company, those crews are going out there mowing lawns like every day. Maybe you have a business where it's like the cadence is a little bit more spread out, like you do maybe 1 or 2 projects a month instead of like crews going out every day. But the point is, they don't just happen one time, they happen over and over again. And so the benefit of that is that if you're able to influence that activity in a positive way, it can show up like pretty quickly as a result in your business. On the flip side, if you just don't pay attention to it and you let it flow, because there's so many like revolutions of this activity affecting your business, it can have a detrimental effect as well. That's why it's really important to pay attention to it. So I have this little expression here to demonstrate what these little like micro contributions could look like. So instead of having just 5 units in black squares, I've got sort of like 5 little additional, or there's there's 6 of them, 6 little additional squares like making their way through the filter, and having those be like contributions to profit. And the reason that's sort of like a relevant visualization is because when you make those small adjustments, and we're going to see that as we sort of move through this, when you make those small adjustments find their way down to profit. And if you do those over and over again over time, it ends up having a big impact. So, and just by the way, like, this is what every private equity company is trying to do. They're trying to influence these small adjustments for big outcomes for companies just like yours. They're just doing it on a larger scale, but the activity is the same. And so that the reason I bring that example in is to show, like, if it's powerful for them, it's powerful for you. Okay, so project costing, same concept as unit economics. It's just like things are happening on a different cadence, slight modification in vocabulary. So lots of businesses we work with have this kind of profile where they sell a project for $10,000, cost them $6,000 to do it, and then they end up with $4,000 of profit. And so the gross margin on that profit on that project is 40%. Now, I just want to make a quick comment about that number, because there are a lot of companies that are selling work at 40% and thinking that that's satisfactory, or thinking that they can't sell any better than that. But it's not enough for your business. And the reason it's not enough is because it's not enough to grow the business. It's not enough to pay people more. And candidly, it's not enough to make the grind worthwhile. Because like this is such difficult work, as everybody who's like experiencing the small business ownership or operating knows all too well. So it is enough to start a business and validate that you have a real thing. So when you start your business, you sell work at this basis, and it makes a lot of sense, right? You need that justification. You need to sort of like test the market, and then you get that validation. But you can't stay that way. And the reason is because, like, as we've seen, like the next filter, if you have 3 units occupying operating expense, like then you're only going to be left with like 1 unit of profit if you sell work at this rate. So I want to just touch on how this activity relates to the macro business performance and what we're trying to do here. So here's an example of a small project that has a 37% gross margin. You can see it's tiny, $787 price, cost almost $500 to do it, and the profit's almost $300. Now, if you do work at this 37% margin enough times, that's what your business is going to look like. So it's important not to be casual about this, because what you're doing is either supporting the ambition of the business from a financial output standpoint, or it's detracting from it. And that's why you need to sort of like monitor this on a continuous basis. So here's an example of that, taking from that same business, same snapshot from QuickBooks Online, showing like what the margin is of the business in general. So in general, this is a 60% gross margin business. So if we just like refer back to this project example, he or she must be doing work and must be doing projects that are much more profitable than 37%. Like some have to be 70%, right? To account for this kind of like variability in project outcome. So what you do on the small level reflects to the large level. That's why paying attention to the small stuff is so important. So here's an example. Here's a page with a bunch of numbers, but we'll just move through it quickly because it's, you can stay with the PDF if you want to refer back to it. But here's an example of a $500,000 business. I've just moved the economics into a monthly format because a lot of people are thinking about these numbers on a monthly basis. So then further, so say you have a $41,000 a month business. If we further divide that into sort of like, say, 4 projects per month. So taken your monthly revenue number in this hypothetical scenario and just reduced it down to four events, right? So just say it's like 4 projects. That's a very relatable circumstance for a lot of owners that we work with. So if you sell a project for $10,000, it costs roughly $5,000 to produce it. Like, those are numbers that are meaningful and relevant to a lot of the owners we work with. So here's where it gets interesting. When you go from the project economics, 10,000, 5,200, 5,200, if you sell that same work for $10,417, if you just follow with me, these are the second row of the two squares going from project to change. What the only adjustment I've made here is, instead of saying that the cost of that project is $5,208, it's $5,000. And that's a $200 change in the economics of that project. We're saying it costs $200 less to produce. So this is a decision rooted in a business that's doing $500,000 worth of business, just as a framework, or as context, I should say. So the result of that individual project is that it's 2% more profitable, because the gross margin goes up to 52% and your profit results in 2% more than what you had previously. Now, if you do that over and over again, so, this would be roughly sort of like, 49, call it 50 projects. If you made a $200 decision over and over again, like 50 times, and to get this kind of like $500,000 approximate like revenue business, you would add 2% to your bottom line, like as a result, like overall. So if you started applying the framework that we thought through in the first section and got 2% in that way, similar size business, and then you did the same exercise and just held the line, made a big deal about small things like a $200 decision, and just repeated that, you'd find yourself with two additional percentage points of profit. So like, if you had a 6%, net profit business, like, you'd have a 10% net profit business. That's a big change right there. And it's a change that's rooted in a $200 decision on a $10,000 project, but you make it once and then you do it over and over again. That is the whole key. It's just, I can't say it enough times. It's about making a big deal about the little things. So this is how we stack these wins and apply them to the big picture. And we're going to do that again in the third section as it relates to price. And I'm super excited to get into it. Thanks a bunch.